Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in person at the Rockefeller Institute and also remotely online. Thank you so much. My name is Ann Stromfeld. I'm the program coordinator here at the Institute. And today we are going to hear from the Center for Law and Policy Solutions internship that I run. Every semester, this internship works on a research project that culminates in a written piece and a presentation that you'll see here today. The CLPS internship is meant to provide undergrad students the skills in public policy research and looking also at professional development skills. This fall semester, this incredible group looked at a snapshot of fashion legislation across 3 US states. You're going to hear all about that right now, so please welcome them here today. Thank you so much for being here.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. Today we'll be presenting to you in Vogue fashion legislation in 3 states. Now, my name is Jada Reed, and the 4 of us here today have had the amazing opportunity of being a part of the Center of Law and Policy Solutions internship here at the Rockefeller Institute of Government. Now, I'd like to start by letting you know a little bit more about me. I am currently a junior at the University at Albany, and I am majoring in communications with a minor in art. I'd like to give my fellow interns the opportunity to introduce themselves to you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Danielle Carpenter. I'm a sophomore at the University at Albany, majoring in public policy and minoring in law and philosophy.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sophia Chanelli. I'm currently a senior at UAlbany. My major is political science, and my minors are women's gender sexuality studies and Judaic studies.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mickey Zhang, and I'm also a student at the University of Albany. I'm a current junior, double majoring in public policy and economics, as well as minors in international studies and Korean.
Now, once again, we want to say thank you very much for taking the time to be here today. Now for our research. When it came to our research, we examined legislative efforts addressing practices and impacts of the fashion industry, specifically in 3 states. California, New York, and North Carolina. And we did this within the 2023 and 2024 legislative session. Now, these states were specifically chosen because of their unique impact that they have within the fashion industry. So when we look at all 3 of them together, we can actually see that they have a very unique production process. So they all kind of go hand in hand together. So we'll start with California. When we look at California, their manufacturing industry is projected to generate approximately $3.71 billion within revenue for the year of 2024 alone. Not only that, but the state's clothing stores are expected to generate around $43.8 billion in revenue. And this is because when we look at a state like California, they have the responsibility of making raw textile into finished garments. So the clothes we wear now, that is what they're responsible for making. Now, when we move on to New York is the home for around 180,000 fashion workers, and this makes up around 6% of New York's workforce. And we see that their workforce generates around $10.9 billion in total wages. Not only that, but we'll also see that New York's clothing and accessory stores, they generate around $28 billion in revenue for this year of 2024. That is because New York is home to a lot of fashion houses and a lot of major brands, and this is why we see that so much revenue is coming out of New York. And lastly, when we look at North Carolina, their textile manufacturing sectors are around 395. They have establishments within the state, and this is home to around over 25,000 workers within this industry. And this makes up for 25% of the United States fashion workers. And we see that this is happening within the state of North Carolina because when we look at the state, they're responsible for making the raw textile. So the fabric that gets turned into garments later, they're the ones that essentially make it so that we're able to have clothes. Now, we can see that by looking at these 3 states side by side, we can get a very good look of the production process that is happening around the fashion industry. And because we can see such a great peak inside of this industry, we see that there's also a lot of impacts that are happening. So we're going to specifically focus on 3, which is labor rights, consumer safety, and the environment. Now, while we all need clothes, we kind of don't realize how much production and sales and disposal can negatively affect our environment. And we can see that researchers and stakeholders and reporters have only recently highlighted how much that this has been contributing to our environment. And one of these reasons is because fast fashion has recently evolved over the years. Now, fast fashion, for anyone who doesn't know, is the model of quick production. So inexpensive clothing being distributed at a very fast rate, and because it's being distributed at such a high rate, it causes a lot of labor rights violations, a lot of environmental impacts, and because they're trying to hide what's going on, we see that there's not a lot of supply chain transparency when we look within the fast fashion production process. Now, for our presentation, we would like to explore some state legislators which are addressing these issues in recent bills and laws. First, we'll discuss our background research and the key issues related to the fashion industry. And then we'll outline our methodological approach, which we'll do before discussing our findings and analysis. Now, to start us off with our background, I'd like to pass it over to Danielle.
Thank you, Jada. Labor rights and workplace safety have been major issues in the U.S. since the dawn of industrialization, but they also persist today for the fashion labor force and the majority of women involved. During the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911, 146 workers were killed in New York City's Greenwich Village, mainly women and children. These workers died through various means, mainly from both from the fire itself and from the working conditions they were in, namely the storerooms being locked from the outside to prevent workers from taking breaks, the sprinkler system not running, the hose where the fire started being rotten, and the fire escape being too small for all workers to use. Though conditions did not change overnight, this event sparked a turning point in governmental policies surrounding labor rights, especially in New York, where the event occurred. However, workers in some garment manufacturing facilities today can still face unsafe, unfair conditions. For instance, in 2020, the Los Angeles apparel factory, after reopening amid the pandemic to make masks, was shut down after being found in violation of COVID-19 guidelines, causing 300 workers to become infected and 4 to die. Still, much of the fashion sold in the US today is now produced internationally, with 97% of production occurring overseas. Production is often moved overseas to reduce costs through labor and less stringent regulations on workplaces and safety. Though only 3% of fashion production is made in the US, it is still a significant aspect economically and very relevant today for both workers and consumers. In the 1990s, an investigation of the jeans brand Guess by the Department of Labor found that workers were being paid piece rate or per item rather than by salary or by the hour. This was a rate at which even the most fast-working individuals fell below the minimum wage and were not being paid the legally required overtime for the longer hours many of them were working. After a few years, Guess then began moving production overseas, decreasing the 75% of production in California to 35% and moving the remaining 40% to Mexico and South America. On the other side of the fashion industry are those who, rather than making the clothes, make consumers want to buy them, models. As noted by New York nonprofit, the Model Alliance, models, mostly women and girls across the globe, have not only been at greater risk of being exploited by their employers for debt bondage, sexual abuse, and human trafficking, but also broader labor rights violations. Model management companies often have power of attorney, meaning they have power to accept payments on behalf of the models, book jobs, negotiate the model's rate of pay, and give third parties permission to use the model's image. This leaves models vulnerable outside of their individual contracts because employers are not required or compelled to do anything without the law, even if it may be in the model's best interest. There is nothing preventing management companies from booking jobs that may pose safety risks to the model or well-being risks. No regulations ensuring they'll be paid fairly. This vulnerability can lead to exploitation and issues with a lack of transparency and accountability on account of model management companies when it comes to the models, basic issues like labor rights and having insight into one's finances.
To transition into another effect we found on the fashion industry. In addition to ongoing labor issues, in recent years, researchers, reporters, and environmental health and safety advocates have highlighted the use of harmful chemicals in various processes across the fashion industry. The new and continued use of these toxic chemicals has been brought to light and caused concern among these groups. Some of these harmful chemicals include lead, which can be found in dyes and can be hazardous to children. We also find polyphenol exfoliates, which are a detergent-like substance which can be extremely harmful to marine life as well as human health. Also, we have seen the continued use of per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, which are water and fireproof substances which can show up in a variety of clothing like waterproof clothing, firefighting gear, outdoor clothing, and a variety of other waterproof pieces. These substances, when they are exposed to humans, have raised concern as they can have various effects that lead to certain cancers. This issue does not just exist in the US for consumers here, as both consumers and workers abroad have been exposed to these harmful chemicals throughout the production processes of manufacturing due to the global nature of the industry and manufacturing supply chain. Fast fashion brands such as Shein and Temu have been investigated in recent years for their continued use of these harmful chemicals. They use these chemicals to preserve the wear of cheaper synthetic fabrics like polyester or nylon. A Canadian study surveying 38 pieces of clothing from these brands that range from adults, children, and kids' clothing found that 1 in 5 of these pieces of clothing had elevated levels of these harmful chemicals. And now I'll pass it over to Mickey.
Thank you, Sophia. So now we're going to be talking a little bit about the environmental impacts. The fashion industry's environmental footprint is large. According to the United Nations Environmental Program, the industry is responsible for around 10% of the global's carbon emissions, around 20% of wastewater. Its pollution stems from key processes such as yarn preparation, fiber production, and dyeing, which can release harmful toxic chemicals into the air and water while consuming mass amounts of water. For example, it takes around 2,000 gallons of water to produce one pair of jeans. It is also the second largest consumer industry of water, according to the UN. Fashion also contributes to ocean pollution. Synthetic fibers such as nylon and polyester shed microplastics into the ocean with each wash. Around 5,000 tons of microplastics are shed into the ocean each year. These microplastics not only pollute marine ecosystems, but also impact the human food chain, posing both health risks to the wildlife and people alike. In addition, fast fashion also leads to massive textile waste. According to the Environmental Protection Agency's most recently available data, in 2018, there was nearly 13 million tons of clothing and footwear waste. And of that, just over 9 million tons were landfilled and around 2.2 million incinerated and under 1.7 million recycled. An even smaller amount, yet still significant, is shipped to countries like Ghana, which in 2021 was the world's largest importer of used clothing. Once imported, these textiles are sold in saturated second-hand markets where unsold piles of clothes end up in warehouses and/or are burned or dumped, causing further environmental and human health impacts. Our research focuses on the states of California, New York, and North Carolina. And the impact of fast fashion and fashion-related issues, however, is a global one.
Now, for our methodological approach, we conducted background research to start off, and we did this in order to understand the broader landscape that the research and reporting is on the fashion industry within the recent years. Now, we organized our research into spreadsheets to identify key terms and concepts to inform our later ongoing legislation. And to help us better understand our background research as well, we conducted 2 informal interviews, one with fashion writer Alyssa Hardy, and the second one with the executive director of the Model Alliance, Sarah Ziff. Now, these experts within the industry helped us to focus our eyes on what we should be looking for in these legislations so that we're not kind of all over the place, but we have a nice way to direct so we can better organize our research. Now, when it came to our legislation, we looked at Legiscan, which is a national legislative database that allowed us to access the legislation within California, New York, and North Carolina. And we zoned in on, again, the years 2023 to 2024. Now, using inclusive terms from our background research, such as clothing, garment worker, sweatshops, we were able to identify over 600 potential bills that could have been relevant to the research that we were conducting. But after thoroughly going through and reviewing and analyzing each bill, we were able to see that only 37 of them were relevant to the research that we wanted to put out. And we organized all of this data with thematically coding these bills. So when we thematically code these bills, we coded them based off what they related to. For example, if it related to labor rights or consumer safety or environmental harm. And lastly, we created a cross-reference, which we were able to put the bills if they were passed, enacted, and we coded them by state and by code.
Now we're going to discuss the fashion legislation we identified in the respective states of California, New York, and North Carolina. There is a total of 37 identified legislation in the year of 2023 to 2024. And looking at this bar graph, we can see that 9 are for California, 25 from New York, and 3 from North Carolina. New York has the largest amount of bills introduced, with North Carolina the least. However, each state legislature introduced a vastly different amount of bills in total. And out of these 37 bills, 9 bills were passed and 8 were enacted into law across the 3 states, with 6 from California, 2 from New York, and 1 from North Carolina. Within each state, different codes and there are different issues related to fast fashion, and fashion apparel appeared to be at the forefront.
California is home to over 200,000 garment workers, most of whom are immigrants or women. In Los Angeles alone, we found that there are over 45,000 cutting and sewing operators who are making textiles and fashion pieces for the industry every single day. To zoom in on our legislation in California, during the 2023 to 2024 legislative session, California introduced 2,124 bills in total. Of these bills, we found that 9 were relevant to the fashion industry. 6 of these bills were passed and enacted, while 3 were vetoed. The most frequent codes that we attributed to these bills were labor rights and waste. Additionally, 4 of these bills were signed into law and were coded as labor rights, and 3 out of 4 of these bills were chaptered, while 1 was not. Of the other 2 bills, 1 was waste and the other was coded as thrift stores. An example of an enacted law that we found relevant in California was Senate Bill 707. This bill amends the California Integrated Waste Management Act of 1989. This bill requires manufacturers and producers to form or join a producer responsibility organization, or an RPO. These RPOs were required to submit a complete plan for approval regarding the safe and proper management of textiles in the state. It also requires an annual and 5-year plan and also outlines penalties for these actors. This bill increases accountability in manufacturing to reduce waste and pollution within the state of California.
Now moving on to New York City has around 900 fashion companies headquartered in New York City, and it brings around $10.9 billion in total wages annually. While the textile manufacturing has been in decline over the years, the industry still employs around 7,000 people working within the fields of design and creative roles. In the 2023 to 2024 legislative session, New York introduced a total of 25 bills out of approximately 24,000 bills total. New York introduced more fashion-related bills than the other two states of California and North Carolina, although it also generally introduces more bills as a whole. New York's 25 bills also spanned a wider range of codes. Out of the 25 bills identified to be related to fast fashion, one bill was enacted and one bill was passed. They are separately coded as economic development and labor rights and workplace safety. Of the 25 bills introduced, 10 addressed labor rights and workplace safety, 7 focused on consumer safety and environmental health, and 5 dealt with waste. One of the bills enacted was Senate Bill 9832, which focuses on model rights. It seeks to create clear guidelines for model agent companies, specifically protecting models' financial rights and legal rights. It mandates more transparencies from agency when it comes to contracting and financial dealings, addressing a long-standing issue where models have been historically underpaid and exploited. While this bill was passed, it has yet been signed into law by the governor. While New York has introduced many fast fashion-related bills, not all of them made it through the legislative process. Many never made it to the floor for a vote, although that is not uncommon for any particular given bill. For instance, there were proposals aiming at extending producer responsibility for textile, which meant companies would be held responsible for the disposal of their products at the end of their life cycle. Another bill aimed at regulating toxic chemicals in textiles. There were also bills designed to improve working conditions, namely prohibiting workers from working in extreme heat environments. And another focused on reducing waste from dry cleaning operations. While these bills did not pass because they haven't gotten voted on, their introduction highlights growing concerns about the environmental impact and labor conditions in the fashion industry. And I'm going to pass it over to Danielle, who will be talking to us about North Carolina.
North Carolina employs over 35,000 textile workers, making up 25% of all textile production in the U.S. The state is home to over 400 facilities, including spinning mills, weaving plants, and dyeing operations. During the 2023-2024 session, 1,996 bills were introduced. Of these bills, 3 were found to be relevant to our research, one of which was passed and enacted. All 3 bills were coded as labor rights and had to do with labor rights and workplace safety. That being said, while these bills would affect garment workers, they were not specifically or explicitly directed to address them. Of the bills that did not pass, one had to do with increasing the minimum wage, while the other attempted to prohibit employment at will, or the practice of firing someone at any time for any reason without any warning. The one enacted bill, Senate Bill 542, made broader changes to North Carolina's labor code and will be touched on later in this presentation.
Now, for our issue types, there were specifically 3 sets of codes that were frequently found during our analysis for the 2023 to 2024 session. And these 3 were labor rights and workplace safety, consumer safety, and environmental health and waste.
For labor rights and workplace safety, 21 bills were introduced and thematically coded, making this the most frequent code used in our research. Of these bills, 6 were passed, with 5 total enacted. 4 in California, 0 in New York, and 1 in North Carolina. The single passed bill was in New York. Those that passed aimed at expanding protections and the ability to enforce labor law provisions for fashion industry workers. Bills that passed addressed employment specifically by amending the labor code to prevent the exploitation of workers by their employers through wage theft, discrimination, and making it mandatory to communicate the workers' rights clearly and in multiple languages. This is enforced through an expanded penalty system, whereas instead of using a civil penalty as in prior legislation, California's Labor Commissioner may now investigate an alleged violation, order temporary relief, issue a citation, and file a civil action. While many bills pertaining to labor rights in general were passed, only one in our research was found to pertain to workplace safety, namely Senate Bill 542 in North Carolina, making broader changes to the state's labor laws. Some changes included adjustments to penalties for violations of laws regarding youth employment, changes to definitions having to do with workplace safety, such as chief inspector, imminent danger, menace to public safety, and updating laws surrounding workplace equipment, such as boilers and pressure vessels. This is especially pertinent to fashion industry because boilers are used to dye clothes, while pressure vessels are used in textile finishing process, ensuring that chemicals are applied to clothes, making them water resistant, flame retardant, and repellent to water. While the ratio of passed bills labor rights bills being 3-1 regarding labor rights versus workplace safety, it appears that legislators are more concerned with labor rights in practices in a workplace over workplace safety.
For our next code, we have consumer safety and environmental health. Of the 37 bills that we researched, we found that 6 were relevant to consumer safety and environmental health, all introduced in New York. None of these bills were able to go through the complete process of being enacted into law in the 2023 to 2024 legislative session. These bills introduced mostly regarded consumer safety, highlighting the issue of harmful chemicals in various products across the fashion industry. For example, Assembly Bill 9005, sent to committee, proposed to address this issue by phasing out intentionally added PFAS in various products across the fashion industry. Most of these introduced bills highlighted the threat of toxic chemicals when they come into contact with the environments that the fashion industry reaches in these 3 states. If enacted, these bills could provide a precedent for the fashion industry in legislation. They aim to improve transparency and consumer safety and provide a process to monitor and remove these harmful chemicals from the marketplace.
Another issue type in which we identified is waste. Only California and New York introduced bills in the legislative session of 2023 to 2024 relevant to waste. For bills related to waste, 7 were introduced and 2 enacted. Of the 2 bills introduced in California, both were enacted, namely Assembly Bill 2632 and Senate Bill 707. Meanwhile, New York introduced 5 bills with none enacted. Bills that passed into law address the ongoing issue of the pollution of microfibers and chemicals from clothing which enter water sources from washing machines. Microfiber filtration systems that will be implemented in California will protect consumers against health issues, especially since the production of synthetic textile is expected to triple by 2050, increasing potential pollution across the country. While bills holding manufacturers accountable for proper management but requiring producer responsibility organizations were passed, other bills holding manufacturers accountable for the life cycles of their products did not. An example of a vetoed bill coded under waste was Senate Bill 6654 from New York, which would require that by 2050 producers must ensure that their textiles are part of a collection, recycling, and reuse system. This would allow for the convenient, no-cost access to collection sites for discarded clothes. These clothes would be recycled or repurposed, diverting millions of tons from landfills. This seems to point to legislators passing bills more concerned with manufacturers creating a system to reduce waste and future production by enforcing penalties and phasing out harmful practices. Our research found less intention towards legislation regarding the aftermath of current production and its effects within these three states in the 2023 to 2024 legislative session.
So although our scope was limited, we wanted to provide an initial snapshot of recent legislative action pertaining to the fashion industry in key states during the 2023 to 2024 session. 9 out of our 37 bills we researched were passed, with 8 enacted into law. Most of the bills introduced, 21 of them, were addressing labor rights and workplace safety. California was the most active on this front, with 4 out of 5 of those bills enacted being in California. These bills generally address labor rights in the fashion industry by establishing new requirements for manufacturers and contractors, or expanding existing requirements for new entities, and also outlining penalties and enforcement for violations. One such further bill was enacted in North Carolina, and another being passed in New York. This bill pertained to model rights, but has not been signed or vetoed. Similarly, though less numerous, of the 7 bills related to waste, they also established new requirements and penalties on actors, including one of the 2 such bills enacted. Of the 2 bills enacted, they pertain to extending producer responsibilities and thrift stores. On the other hand, we found that no bills enacted of the 6 introduced regarded consumer safety, though New York was the only state with legislation concerning this issue. To wrap up, I'll pass it over to Mickey for our conclusion.
And as we conclude today's discussion, I'd like to take a moment to highlight our research in the respective states of California, New York, and North Carolina for the legislation related to fashion introduced and passed or enacted. The reason why we chose these respective states are for their different roles in clothing production. California, which focuses on manufacturing, New York for designing, and North Carolina for the production of raw materials. We found 37 pieces of legislation relevant to fashion, in which 9 passed and 28 didn't. We then coded relevant pieces of legislation and found the most frequent issue types to be labor rights and workplace safety, consumer safety and environmental health, and waste. Fashion industry has a global impact, as we have mentioned. While we have discussed fashion legislation from the 2023 to 2024 legislative session in 3 respective states, we want to emphasize that this industry has issues that have a global impact, such as health and environmental issues. Meanwhile, federally, the U.S. can make impact on domestic clothing production with the passage of fashion-related bills, but also potentially engage in trade deals that can impact a larger aspect of worldwide fashion. Overall, these laws and pieces of legislation are important to address the impacts of the fashion industry within the states of New York, California, and North Carolina. And that concludes our presentation. And we would like to take a moment to thank everyone who is present today with us and online. We would also like to thank Zam Strumfeld and Laura Rabineau for being our mentors throughout this journey, and everyone who has helped us with our research, and of course the Rockefeller Institute. We would like to thank everyone again for listening and being here, and we are happy to take any questions at this time.
Thank you. Yes?
Hi there. I'm buzzy.
All right, so my
did you think about going back a little bit further to generally post-pandemic and kind of the big rise of fast fashion? And I guess what led to the decision to limit it to just that session?
So we wanted to focus on the most recent legislation, but we did do some extra research about the bills and maybe the environment and attitudes of the fashion industry that have led us to studying this legislative session. And although we don't have much specific bills to highlight, we did do our background research and found that the fashion industry in recent years has been growing thanks to the rise of fast fashion. And we have found that this legislative session was important to understand where we've come from in the past 10 to 15 years with the rise of fast fashion and the global market industry, and also where we want to go forward and improving the lives of workers and consumers within the U.S. Yes.
Let's try it again, Brian. Hi, thanks. I'm Brian Backstrom. I know that you talked about legislation that looked at labor protection, some labor rights. You mentioned some minimum wage things that were enacted. I think that was North Carolina. And you talked about workplace conditions of some of the models, I think, particularly in New York. Do you have thoughts or perceptions on workplace conditions in, I think one of your slides mentioned sweatshops, either here or abroad, but so, you know, things like minimum wage wouldn't necessarily address those conditions, but did you do any looking at workplace conditions in what are commonly known as sweatshops?
Go ahead. No, you got it. Good. Okay. So when it came to sweatshops, we even saw some within Albany. There were some things passed that regarded upstate region alone, that actions had to be taken for the area of state like Rochester, Syracuse, even up here, that a bill was enacted so that we can limit that, especially within schools. So we saw it pertaining to even the apparel that we wear within even a school like UAlbany. But when we looked, that's mostly what we saw when it regarded sweatshops. We tried to look more and we saw more research regarding that. The bills were limited, but it's not that they weren't there. They're making their way into law. And
I would also add on to the global aspect. We've looked into countries like Ghana, and there are also many other countries in which countries like the U.S. would move manufacturing outside of the U.S. because it is more cheaply to do so and within their incentive to do so. And a lot of the times it's harder to regulate outside of the country, specifically regarding workplace safety or even minimum wages. And oftentimes not only do these workers work in conditions that are unsafe, they also get exploited where they are not informed of the types of chemicals are in these dyes, and they may take these projects home to their own villages and end up polluting water streams that become health issues for not only that individual worker, but creating an impact to others within their community that are sharing this water resource.
Hiya. Can you talk a little bit about how the legislation that you guys followed in these 3 states functions in the broader context of U.S. fashion regulation, previous laws? Because, states only have so much power. How does this all sort of fit together? What's happened at the federal level?
I think as far as the 3 states that we looked at, with them being focusing on those specific sectors of production, with New York really pertaining to models, North Carolina pertaining to textile production, and California with assembling clothes themselves, we mainly looked at these states just for that broader overview of looking at those sectors, which is why we picked them. As far as federal legislation, most of the bills that were passed, since those states had to do with those areas, the bills that were passed and looked at and introduced are the ones that are sort of at the forefront of making any advancements in fashion legislation. On the federal level, there is the Fabric Act and the Fashion Workers Act, which Fabric Act pertains more to labor rights in factories. It was introduced in 2023 in New York. So that's working its way up to the federal level. And the Fashion Workers Act, which has to do with models and model protections, also introduced in New York in 2023. So both of these they have not been enacted yet, but they are getting there. So that's what we're looking at federally.
I would also like to add just quickly onto it. A lot of the states, they do have a stake in this legislative process and the fashion industry, but they are limited in certain ways by the lack of federal attention towards the fashion industry in general.
I have a question more about the research process. So what, throughout this process, what was like your favorite part, or what was something that surprised you? Or you are all young researchers, so kind of what did you enjoy most about this process?
When it came to the research process, I'd say something that surprised me and also one of my favorite parts was the interviews. Specifically the one with Alyssa Hardy, the fashion writer, because she shed some insight into what is actually going on within a lot of the production processes that are actually hurting a lot of lives, like in third world countries and everything like that. So getting more insight about what is actually happening within the industry was one of my favorite parts, and broadening my mind and seeing the broader landscape within the fashion industry was really great. So yeah.
I would also add to that, reading Alyssa Hardy's book, More Now, she does delve into more of that post-2020 production process as far as fast fashion goes. So having that background insight when we look at the 2023 legislation was really nice to have.
Next question.
So I study information science. So my interest is in what information are we giving people. And I know Mickey mentioned like the dyes and the villages might not have information about what's dangerous there. And you mentioned earlier about PFAS and some of the other chemicals that are going into our clothes. Did you see any bills? I think you said you didn't see much, but did you see any bills that had anything to do with consumer information, like getting the consumers more information about what's in their clothing?
We did not find such types of bills in the 2020 to 2024 legislative session. I will note that there is a action, I'm not sure if I think it has passed through, but in California we found that some manufacturers and clothing will provide a small tag with some information about harmful chemicals that are in their products, and they can be found in some more widely known stores and clothing that has been made.
It's worth it. Hey everybody, great job. I'm wondering if you could expand this research and continue it, what would you want to do next? How would you do that?
I think that for me personally, in order to expand this research, I would want to get more information about the ways in which manufacturers are able to go through their process of outsourcing or hiring vast amounts of immigrant workers, especially in California. And I would just want to learn and teach people more about how those people are recruited into the fashion industry and their kind of untold stories that we kind of got a glimpse into.
I think for me, potentially looking at previous year's legislation. So there is sort of a comparative study of what has been going on within the past few legislative sessions and what is going on currently. But I also would like to look into just the collection of information of fashion-related data, because it's really hard to be tracking these data and numbers regarding fashion, and sometimes even when we spoke with Melissa Hardy, it was quite really difficult to have access to these numbers and research. So I think it seems like there hasn't been much from the collecting of data and numbers and the support of research. So I would like to see how that could potentially be improved in the future, just to have data for future research like this.